Joe Gallagher from Veritas Education, and this is Additional Backup and Restore Troubleshooting. In this lesson, we'll take a look at issues that can affect file system backups, snapshot-backed backups, VMware backups, Hyper-V backups, and also a look at troubleshooting restores. Let's begin by taking a look at troubleshooting file system backups. In general, problems with backup jobs will fit into one of three categories. Either the backup job does not run, it doesn't contain the expected data, or it's not successful. Now, if the backup job doesn't run, meaning it's just not created at all, then what we have here is really a scheduling issue. We need to review the schedule for the policy, check the frequency or the calendar, and the start window. Always remember to check both places. Remember that the frequency and the start window work together to determine when your backup job is going to run, and that the NBPemrec utility can be useful for predicting when the next time is that NetBackup is going to run a schedule. I think that this schedule is going to run next Wednesday at 3:30 p.m. Let's check with NBPemrec and see if NetBackup agrees with me, and if not, why not? Now, if the backup is not containing the expected data, that usually means it's an issue with the backup selections. I'll want to go through and review what's listed there and make sure I've put everything on there correctly, especially if I'm using wildcards. I can use the bar console as if I was about to do a restore to verify to make sure that specific files that are very critical are being backed up. Now, if the backup job is just not successful, the job is created, but it runs with a non-zero status code, then I need to do more investigation to see what's going on. If it's a partial success, a status code 1, it might just indicate some busy files. Status codes greater than 1 usually involve deeper troubleshooting. Backup jobs are monitored primarily from the activity monitor. This information is also accessible from BPDB jobs from the command line. And of course, what we're looking for is a status of 0, success, with a little NetBackup guy. Everything worked and everything is restorable. Now, the status code 1 is a partial success, which means we backed up most of what we were trying to protect, but not everything. Some files could not be backed up, usually because they were locked by either an application or the operating system, and NetBackup was unable to get in there even to do a read on this data. Most of the time, like a standard file, like a Word document, NetBackup can get in there to do a read of the last saved version. But in this case, it was not able to, so I need to take a look at the details of the job where NetBackup will tell you exactly which files couldn't be protected, and then I need to ask myself the question, how much do I care about this? What are these files? Is this temporary internet, cache, blah, blah, blah junk, that I don't really care about? Well, if so, add it to the exclude list so that we stop trying to back it up and we get status code 0. On the other hand, if I take a look at this and I say, oh no, this is important stuff here that's not getting protected, well, then I need to see what can I do about that. I'm going to need to find a way to quiesce the application so that these files are accessible during backup time and can be protected. Now, the other icons here that they're mentioning on the activity monitor, active jobs, of course, are running. Queued jobs are waiting for resources so that they can begin running. Failed jobs are status code greater than 1. Nothing was backed up and nothing is restorable. So I've got to go do some troubleshooting to resolve that. The last two, the incomplete and the suspended, will only ever show up if you're using the checkpoint restart option on your backup policies. Checkpoint restart means that many types of job failures, instead of entering the failed state, they'll enter the incomplete state when they hit a problem. And that means that if I can correct the issue, I can pick up from the last checkpoint instead of going all the way back to the beginning. And checkpoints are taken by default every 15 minutes, so this can be a huge time saver when I have issues. Okay, I ran into a problem with this job, but I was able to correct it and, pretty much pick up pretty much where I was when I encountered the issue, rather than going all the way back to the beginning again, which for a long backup can be very frustrating. Incomplete is a temporary state. The job will only stay in this state for a few hours, and then it'll eventually fail. You can configure exactly how long jobs stay in the incomplete state from the master server host properties. Now, the suspended state is also possible with checkpoint restart, but suspended is a manual action. somebody right-clicked on the job and ordered it to be suspended, and that's kind of like hitting the pause button. That's why we try to make the icon look like that. And usually the reason why someone would do that is to free up resources. I need to do a high priority restore from tape. All of my tape heads are busy writing backups right now. Rather than cancel one of those jobs to free up a tape head, I'd rather just suspend one. And then the restore job can run, and then once the restore is finished, I can unsuspend it and pick up where I left off with the minimum of interruption there. Remember, if you're doing that, the real sequence of events is to create the restore job first, get it queued up, then suspend one of the backup jobs, and then because of its high priority, the restore job should then start running. You'll also notice in the activity monitor that there are some state details. NetBackup will always try to give you some reason why a job is in a particular state. For example, here we see some queued up jobs here, and they're queued up because the limit has been reached for a particular resource. And if I were to scroll to the right, I could get a little more detail about that. Maybe it's maximum jobs per client or a setting like that. For backup jobs that just don't run, this is most often a misunderstanding of how scheduling works in NetBackup. And again, it is key to look at the frequency or the calendar on the first tab of the schedule and the start window on its own separate tab. Always remember that frequency plus start window controls when your jobs run, and those start windows indicate a day of the week as well as a time. And so if I have a schedule where I set a frequency to once per day, and I have a start window open once per week on Sunday evenings, that's really a weekly schedule. It might say it's once per day on the first tab, but if I've only got a window open once a week, that's how often it's going to run, at least automatically. So make sure that you're familiar with how this works in NetBackup. Remember that manual backups affect frequency-based schedules. Manual backups count as a backup for frequency purposes. So if I normally run a backup every Sunday, like my previous example, and I do a manual backup on Wednesday, NetBackup will not be looking to start the job automatically again until the following Wednesday. In other words, it will skip the next Sunday backup, which is why folks do sometimes set the frequency for a job to be less than what they're actually looking for, knowing that they will control exactly when it runs using the start window. Also remember, if I make a change to a backup policy, NetBackup is polling every 10 minutes to pick up those changes. I can force that to happen immediately with the nbpemrec command, nbpemrec-update policies, to immediately refresh the NetBackup with the change that I just made. nbpemrec is also key to get information about when NetBackup is planning on running a schedule in the future. So again, I am pretty positive this schedule is going to run next Sunday night. I can use nbpemrec to verify that, and make sure that NetBackup agrees with me. I can also use nbpemrec with more detailed commands to get it to list its subsystems, to find out reasons why the scheduler is not planning on running a job until a certain time. Okay, I think it should run Wednesday. NetBackup says it's not going to run till Sunday. That you can get more detail from nbpemrec about that. The output of nbpemrec-subsystems can be very detailed. I may sometimes have to work with support to really understand what I'm looking at. For backup jobs that do not contain the correct data, I need to review the backup policy. Of course, make sure the correct client is selected, and also check the backup selections. Make sure that the data I'm looking for is part of the selections. Be particularly careful if you're using wildcards, and you may want to test using ls from a terminal window in Unix, or dir from the command window in Windows to make sure the wildcards I'm using actually list the files that I'm expecting to protect. The backup selections list is going to capture files when you use wildcards pretty much the same way a command or a terminal window would. Another thing to think about is that if I have multiple items on the backup selections list and one item does not exist on a particular server, NetBackup will skip it and then report status code 0. Say, for example, I've got 6 Windows servers on a policy, and my backup selections list is D, E, and F, and 2 of these servers have an F drive and the rest of them don't. Well, for the servers that have an F drive, NetBackup will protect it and back it up. For the servers that don't have it, NetBackup will just skip it, say, oh, this drive isn't here. No big deal because these other 2 drives were there. As long as NetBackup backs up something, you get a status code 0. And that's a deliberate behavior. The idea is that you can still combine multiple clients on the same policy without their data layout needing to be exactly identical. But it's a behavior that sometimes causes issues if folks are not expecting it. Suppose somebody unmounts a drive, and so that drive is not present at the time of the backup, but other things are. Again, as long as NetBackup backs something up, you're going to get status code 0. The only time you get an error code is if none of the drives exist. If the backup selections list is D, E, and F, and there's a server that doesn't have a D or an E or an F, then you're going to get a status code 71. NetBackup says, hey, you just told me to back up nothing. What's the deal with that? And those status code 71s can be even more common when you use the multiple data streams feature, because each backup selection by default will be broken up into its own job. And for any job that has nothing to back up, you'll get a 71. But the secret to handling this situation where NetBackup may be skipping files is diligence. Take a look at the details of the job. NetBackup will mention if it skips a file. Keep an eye on the amount of data backed up. The details for every backup job will tell you the number of kilobytes written and the number of files written. If you were expecting to back up 400 gigs of data from a server and you backed up 150, this should make you suspicious. All right, what's going on here? How come this was so much less than I expected? Or the opposite problem. Hey, tonight I just backed up 300 gigs more than I usually do. What the heck happened? Did somebody provision a drive and forget to tell the backup admin that they were doing that? We skipped the change control process. So to help you out with this, in addition to the job details, you can also use the variance reports in Op Center. And these reports can be configured with a threshold, so that you say, for example, hey, if I ever back up 10% too much or 10% less than I usually do, fire off an alert about this. Send me an email and say, hey, kind of raise a red flag about it. Here are some examples of verifying that my backup jobs contain the correct data. Now again, right at the time of backup from the activity monitor, I can go through and check to see the total number of files protected and the total number of kilobytes written. That information is also available from reports. The images on media report would give me that information. It's also available from the bar console. I can open up the bar tool and go to the backup history, and I can see from there for a particular backup image how many files were protected. And if I need to, I can use the bar console to drill down to get more detail about exactly which files were backed up. And I can go all the way down to the individual file level if I need to verify that critical files are being protected. I can also access this data from the bpflist command from the command line, which might be a useful thing to know about if you ever need to write a script, because you're being audited and you need to be able to prove not just that you backed up a server, but that you backed up a particular file or a particular set of files on a server, because it's really important stuff. bpflist can help with that. The status code 1, like we mentioned previously, is a partially successful backup. Some folks ding their backup teams on status code 1s and count them as failed jobs, and that's not really fair. It is exactly what it says it is. A status code 1 is a partial success. You did back up some of the data. You probably backed up most of the data. In most cases, it's just a few files that NetBackup wasn't able to get at, and that's why I got the status code 1. And, some reasons are listed on the slide here. Being locked by the application or by the operating system is far and away the most likely reason why we get this code. But there are other circumstances. Maybe we had a read error on a file. Maybe we had a file with a path that was too long for NetBackup to process. Those are less common, but also possibilities. The big thing here is I need to first identify, is this critical data or not? And if it is critical data, what do I need to do to get it protected? If it's an error, like a read error, then okay, I need to find out why I'm getting that. Do I have any physical issues that need to be addressed? If it's locked, which is more likely, what do I need to do to quiesce the application so that the backup will run successfully. Maybe I can just use a snapshot of the data. Maybe I need to use the NetBackup notify scripts to do some pre-processing to quiesce the app, put it in backup mode, or shut it down for a while. For any exit code of status 2 or higher, this is a failure, and so the job will enter the failed state, which is a done state. Or if checkpoint restart is being used, then it'll temporarily be in an incomplete state. And again, that's an opportunity for us to take some corrective action, and then I can resume the job from the last checkpoint. Keep in mind that incomplete is a state that gets entered into automatically, whereas suspended is a manual action. Somebody suspended the job manually from DPDB jobs or from the activity monitor if that happens. Now, NetBackup will automatically retry failed backup jobs. By default, it'll try twice every 12 hours to get that job to run successfully. This interval is adjustable from the master server host properties. Here's an example of NetBackup retrying a failed job. Note that the job ID remains the same here, 258. And so on our first attempt, the job failed with a status code 96. Sometime after that, the administrator corrected the issue, put some new tapes in the tape library or whatever needed to be done. And then 10 minutes later, automatically, NetBackup made a second attempt, and then this time the job ran successfully. And so you can see for a particular job detail in the activity monitor, you can use the attempts column under detailed status to quickly, page back and forth between different attempts to see if it was successful or not, or what kind of problems might have been encountered. When we encounter a status code that we're not familiar with, usually our first action is to try to troubleshoot her. This is available from the activity monitor. It looks up the exit code in the help system and gives us some information about what usually causes this and some suggestions for a workaround. This information is usually identical to what we see in the NetBackup status code reference guide, which is one of the manuals that you can download from support, although it's usually worth checking that document anyway, just to see if perhaps there's some extra detail in the manual that's not in the help system. It's also possible to get this information from Op Center or to get it from the command line using the BP error command. And that can be kind of a cute thing to do if you're writing your own custom scripts and you'd like to get an email notification when you have failed jobs. You can include that syntax so that not only do you get an email saying, hey, a job failed, you find out why it failed and with what code, to get your mind already thinking about what the resolution will be. Here's some general tips for troubleshooting file system backups. Try checking for common misconfigurations within the policy settings, as well as the host properties and other NetBackup settings. Also check for data consistency issues, especially regarding busy files or other issues that can come up when we're trying to back up applications while they're online. Solutions for data consistency might include the use of snapshots or the use of application agents that have been created specifically for the target application. In cases where I'm having issues with busy files and an application needs to be put in backup mode or a snapshot needs to be taken before the job runs, I can use the notify scripts on the client to accomplish this. BP start notify runs before every backup job. BP end notify runs after every backup job. Now these scripts are not running by default. There are samples of these scripts in the goodies directory. So what I would do is I would edit those scripts to add the proper functionality, and then I would copy them from the goodies directory to the NetBackup bin directory, and at that point they'll run every time the client is backed up. Now if I want to, I can append a policy name and even a schedule name if I want to be that specific, so that a script runs only for certain policies and not for all policies. And I might need to do that if I have a client that's being backed up by multiple policies. Now I do have to be careful with client-side scripting, because what's going to happen is if NetBackup sees that the BP start notify script is present in the bin directory, it will run that script and it'll wait for a default of 5 minutes for that script to exit with status code 0. If the script does not return successful status code, or if it doesn't return anything, if the timeout is reached and we haven't heard back from it, NetBackup will fail the job. And the assumption is whatever pre-processing was going to happen, if that wasn't done successfully, then the backup is not going to be useful. So that's the status code 73. The BP start notify failed. That means we got a non-zero exit code. The status code 74 is the timeout, where it was waiting for the script to complete. Now, it's possible that the script is working fine. It's just it takes longer than 5 minutes to quiesce this app because it's very busy. So you can increase the amount of time NetBackup will wait in the master server host properties and increase it from the default of 5 minutes. But you do have to rigorously test any scripts that you're using on the client because you don't want to get failed backup jobs due to silly scripting errors. You want to make sure these scripts are pretty bulletproof before you put them into production. Now, the status code 75 is a client timeout waiting for BPN notify to complete. You'll never get a failed job because of BPN to notify, because NetBackup will go ahead and put the job in the done state while BPN notify is running. And what'll happen is this status code is something that'll get captured in the bcar log if the end script doesn't return success within 5 minutes. But it won't show up in the activity monitor on the master server. In this next topic, we'll discuss troubleshooting snapshot-based backups. A snapshot is a point-in-time copy of a particular set of data, and using a snapshot can help ensure that we're backing up consistent, static data, and it can also minimize the impact of backup on the host system, since usually you just need to quiesce the application and the file system long enough to grab a snapshot, which probably only takes a few seconds. Then the application can go back about its business, and all the backup I/O will be hitting the snapshot, which might be located on a different volume, so we can again minimize our footprint that way. It can also help us out a lot with backing up busy files. It allows us to capture those files in a consistent and most importantly unlocked state. And there's a number of different methods for taking snapshots. It can be application level, it can be operating system level, it can be happening at the level of the disk array that I'm using. It can be done in software on the host using Veritas Storage Foundation. NetBackup has a snapshot client add-on which is compatible with many software and hardware solutions, and it can be used to automate the taking of snapshots for backup purposes. It can also be used to automate getting rid of the snapshots after the backup is done. This slide highlights some of the differences in snapshot-related backups compared to other types of backup jobs. We'll assume here this is a file system backup and a snapshot is being taken maybe at the operating system level by Microsoft VSS, or maybe it's a disk array, that's compatible with NetBackup via Snapshot Client. Either way, the job is initiated by the NetBackup scheduler, NBPEM. The job manager on the master server is responsible for running this job, and when it sees it's going to be a snapshot job, it reaches out to BPBRM on the media server, the backup and restore manager, and starts that process. Remember, that's kind of the boss process on a media server. BPBRM sees that a snapshot needs to be taken, so it calls the BPFIS process, which is the NetBackup frozen image service. And BPFIS is going to be responsible for reaching out to whatever software it needs to talk to get the snapshot created. Once the snapshot is created, then NBJM can start another instance of BPBRM, the Backup and Restore Manager, and this will start the BPBCAR process on the client system. BPBCAR is responsible for reading the data from the client and sending it across the network to the tape manager process on the media server to be written to tape or to disk. Once the backup has completed, then BPBRM is going to send a signal to BPFIS that says, all right, we're all done here, backup was successful, you can now delete this snapshot. BPFIS is responsible for sending the proper commands to delete the snapshot. Once the snapshot has been deleted successfully, BPFIS can report success, exit with status code 0, and then BPBRM can report back upstairs to NBJM, it worked, the snapshot's been deleted, exit with status code 0. Now, in terms of troubleshooting snapshot backups, because there are so many different kinds of snapshot methods that NetBackup supports, there's more to this than can be covered here. The troubleshooting chapter in the NetBackup Snapshot Client Administrator's Guide goes into a fair amount of detail about snapshot troubleshooting. Here's a couple commonly used suggestions. First off, TechNote 47808 describes how to verify Windows Open File backup operations using the Windows VSS service. VSS issues can be common when protecting busy files on Windows servers, so that'll get me started in the right direction. For any snapshot client backup, if there's an issue where the snapshot was not deleted because a process terminated abnormally, I can use the bpfis command to manually invoke the bpfis process, and so I can use that to query and see if there are any snapshots still present. I can use bpfis delete to try and delete snapshots that still exist that shouldn't still be there. Here's some status codes that are associated with snapshots. The status code 1, of course, is the status code we were hoping to solve by using a snapshot. That's the busy or locked file. Do note that it is possible that there are some files on the server that are so busy that they can't be quiesced even for a moment to take a snapshot. Or it may be that the application is not VSS compliant on a Windows server, because VSS is the means that we use to take snapshots by default on Windows. The status code 13 is a file read failure, and that might mean that we're trying to use Snapshot Client to back up an unsupported drive type, or it might mean that the file system we're trying to back up is not currently mounted. Status code 156 is a snapshot error, and this is a fairly broad error code. It means that there was a problem taking the snapshot, but we're going to have to do a little more investigation as to what the problem was. There's usually at least a line or two of information in the details of the job about what happened, but I may have to do an investigation outside of NetBackup. Usually it's whatever service or software was trying to take the snapshot ran into a problem. And all NetBackup knows is it didn't work. Now, with the VSS snapshots that we take routinely on Windows servers, we do VSS snaps by default for every backup of a Windows client. I can take a look at the amount of space in the file system. Remember, these snapshots do use space in the volume that's being snapped by default. Maybe there's just not enough free space for the snapshot. You can configure VSS to put the snapshot on a different volume than the one that's being snapped, and that might help with the space issue. It also might help just in general terms of resource allocation, because it means that I/O to the snapshot will go to a different volume than the volume that's being snapped, in another way to minimize the footprint of my backup operations. As a general rule, anytime a 156 is encountered, always consider lack of resources to be a possible issue. Either lack of disk space, wherever the snapshot is supposed to be created, or an overburdened application or an overburdened server, where we're just trying to take too many snapshots at once and the server is too busy doing other things to be able to accommodate the request. In this next topic, we'll discuss troubleshooting VMware backups. Here's an example of the process flow in VMware backups. In this example over here, we have a NetBackup media server that's also functioning as the backup host, which is the recommended practice, and we have an ESX server with some VMs to protect. And so the first thing that happens is NetBackup sends a signal to the ESX server and asks it to take a snapshot of the data that's being protected, of the virtual machines. The ESX server takes a snapshot of these VMDK files, and that shows up as a snapshot job in the activity monitor. And then NetBackup is going to reach out to those snapshots, in this case across the SAN, and so the zoning is open so that the media server can see these snapshots, and back up the snapshots of these VMDK files and write them to tape or disk. When the backup is complete, NetBackup can then send a signal to ESX that says, all right, I'm all done, everything worked, please delete the snapshot. And so there's some teamwork going on here. Our VMware backups use VMware's API for data protection, oftentimes abbreviated as VADP style backups. And so, for example, with the snapshots, NetBackup is not actually taking the snapshot, it's just asking VMware to do it. If the snapshot doesn't get created or doesn't get deleted even after NetBackup asked it to be deleted, there may be some troubleshooting on the VMware side that I may need to do. Note also the multiple jobs that were created in the activity monitor. Looks like in this case over here there were two virtual machines that I was backing up. It looks like an Exchange server and a SQL server just based on their host names. And so the first job, job 76, was a parent job. And this, like most situations in NetBackup where you get a parent job, this is not actually protecting any data. It's just kind of the babysitter for the overall process. Then for each client that is to be protected, there's a snapshot job where ESX creates a snapshot for NetBackup. And then the last two jobs, 79 and 80, those are the actual backups. So that's the actual data movement there, where NetBackup backs up the snapshots of these VMDK files and writes them to disk or tape. This slide provides an excellent reference for VMware backup and restore log locations. You can use these debug logs to get more information about failed VMware backups. Note that certain debug logs are located on specific hosts, so I need to make sure I'm going to the correct server to find the log that I'm looking for. Here's an example of the process flow for a VMware discovery job. Now this is done when I'm using VMware Intelligent Policies, or VIP, with NetBackup. Means that the VMware policy has got a query to discover clients dynamically at backup time rather than having a static list of clients. And this is really the preferred way for protecting VMware. So what's going to happen is when the job starts on the master server, the scheduler is going to take a look at the NetBackup catalogs to see if it has a recent list of virtual machines. You'll notice in the excerpt here from the policy window where it says reuse VM selection query results for up to 8 hours. So if we're within that time frame, then NetBackup will use the list it already has. Otherwise, it will query either the ESX server or the vCenter server, depending how you've configured it, to get an up-to-date list of VMs. Then once it has a list of VMs to be protected, PIM on the master server is going to start NBCS on the media server. This is the discovery service. This is actually, strictly speaking, the CS stands for Client Services, but it's not commonly called that because we don't want to confuse people with the NetBackup Client Service, which is BPCD. So most people refer to this as Discovery Services. NBCS gets started on the media server, and if the backup host is a separate host from the media server, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, looks like it is in this example, then NBCS on the media server reaches out and starts NBCS on the backup host. NBCS on the backup host is our real interface to VMware. NBCS contains the necessary code to connect to VMware's APIs for data protection and to make the calls for the discovery of virtual machines. And then once the virtual machines to be protected are discovered, NBCS feeds that information back up the line to the master server. The list of machines is saved in an XML file, and so again, if there is subsequent backup activity within 8 hours, that list that is generated can be reused. Here are some general VMware backup troubleshooting tips. Unsupported equipment can cause a wide variety of backup problems. Always make sure the hardware you're using is compatible with VMware. Check the timeouts and the logging values for vSphere. These settings and how to modify them are described in the troubleshooting chapter of the NetBackup for VMware Administrator's Guide. Verify that VMware Tools is installed on all the virtual machines. You don't always have to have the NetBackup client on the VMs to do a backup, but you do need VMware Tools. Now, if you want to do restore of individual files, you would need the NetBackup client present in the VM to receive those files. Now, that's assuming you want to do the restore directly to the VM. you wouldn't need the client installed in the VM if you were going to restore to another location, such as a shared directory. The SymQuies utility is provided for certain Linux platforms to help ensure that the backup data is complete and consistent. With Windows VMs, this is not a big deal because VMware will use Microsoft's VSS service to take the snapshot, and that'll make sure that the data in the VM is consistent. With Linux, there's no such service. And so this is a package that Veritas supplies, which can be installed in the virtual machine to quiesce the file system, to make sure that the snapshot you're getting is restorable. Because otherwise, by default with Linux VMs, you're just getting crash-consistent snapshots, not snapshots that are guaranteed to be recoverable. Here's some examples of common VMware backup status codes. The status code 6 is a failure to back up the requested files and is usually associated with a problem with the transport mechanism. Either I specified an invalid transport mode, or I was trying to use the hot add method with a virtual media server, and we encountered hot add issues. Status call 11 is a system call has failed. This can happen if the SAN policy on the backup host has not been set to online all. That can happen sometimes due to VMware restores with a Windows 2008 backup host failing, which can sometimes cause all SAN LUNs to be presented to the backup host as read-only, which then causes write errors during restores and failed restores. The status code 20 is an invalid command parameter. The storage unit that's specified in the policy is not unique to Windows or other supported media servers. What we mean here is that only certain platforms are supported as backup hosts for VMware. Windows, Red Hat, and SUSE are the three supported platforms. Now, in the VMware tab of the backup policy, you can specify a specific backup host, or you can just say backup media server. If you say backup media server, NetBackup will just pick one of the media servers that's part of the storage unit that's used for the backup policy, and it'll do the load balancing algorithm to try to pick the one with the lightest load. So there is, a motivation to do that. You just have to be careful to make sure that all of the media servers that are associated with the storage unit that the VMware policy is using are valid backup hosts. If there's any invalid backup hosts, for example, a Solaris media server is associated with that storage unit, that's when you risk getting failures with status code 20. The status code 227, the no entity is found. This is really on the restore side, more on the backup side. I'm in the bar console and I'm trying to find files that I want to restore, but I'm getting this, nothing is found, 227 error. It usually means I'm using the wrong identifier to search for the data. Remember, in the bar console, you have to reference the virtual machine using the identifier it was backed up with. We're used to, when we do restores, always using the host name. With VMware, you need to use the identifier that was specified in the policy, which might be the host name, but more commonly is the display name, or it might be the UUID or another identifier. Again, I've got to check the backup policy to be sure. The status code 156 and the 2820, these are fairly broad error codes. We'll talk about them in more detail in upcoming slides. Here's some advice for troubleshooting the status code 156. Like we mentioned, this is a fairly broad status code, and it indicates that VMware was unable to create the snapshot or that the snapshot failed during the backup, and there's a lot of different reasons why this can happen. Here's some of the more common reasons. If NetBackup can't obtain the volume ID of the drive, and that might be because the drive is down. If there's already a backup running against the virtual machine, VMware is not going to allow a second snapshot to be taken, so we're going to need to wait until the first job completes before running this second job. If we can't find the virtual machine, probably means we're using a bad identifier. Check to make sure that the identifier is accurate, or consider using an alternate name such as the UUID. If the virtual machine is powered off, you can back up powered off VMs with NetBackup. It's just that you need to either provide the proper credentials to vCenter to be able to back up a powered off VM, or to use the display name or UUID to ensure success. And that's probably the best method. That's why a lot of places will use display name instead of host name to identify their virtual machines. Disks that are operating in raw mode, RDM, are ignored. Any independent disk on the restore will be recreated in the empty state. Any attempt to create a snapshot that exceeds VMware timeouts will fail. And a lot of times this is due to resources. A lot of 156s can result from either insufficient disk space in the data store to create the snapshot, or that the vCenter or ESX server is just plain trying to do too much. It is extremely important with VMware backups to use VIP policies so that you can make use of the resource limits in the master server host properties and keep the amount of simultaneous activity to VMware under control. Be conservative with those limits. 1 backup per data store, 4 backups per ESX server are good sample starting values. And you might want to set a limit on the vCenter side as well, maybe no more than a dozen simultaneous jobs per vCenter server to prevent us from overwhelming vCenter. Start low, and if everything seems okay, consider raising it, but be very cautious about this. Because of the way that VMware does snapshots, it's somewhat intensive in terms of the amount of processing. You know, a snapshot for VMware is sort of like a transaction log for a database. And it's the snapshot deletion process where oftentimes we run into the resource crunch, because when a snapshot is deleted, that object can't be discarded. All of the I/O have been going to the snapshot object. That stuff all has to be rolled into the original virtual machine like a log replay. So again, be conservative with resource limits. I can't stress that enough. Many, many problems that customers have gotten into over the years just trying to do too many simultaneous backups. Here's some more detail about the status code 2820. This is a VMware policy restore error. So it might result from an ISO file that was available to the VM during the backup, but is now not available at the time that I'm going to do the restore. It might happen because I have a Windows server and the SAN LUNs are offline. Now that might be because of an error, or it might have been on purpose. It's a common practice in some Windows environments to put the SAN LUNs in the offline state in Windows, and that's because we have to give visibility to the data store to the backup host, and that makes some folks nervous. What if a local admin on the Windows server that's the backup host doesn't realize, that these are important disks hosting VMware virtual machines, and they online that disk and try to mount it and use it on their server? They're going to trash all of that data. So that's fine. Go ahead and put the SAN LUNs in the offline state. That's cool for backups, but remember that you need to online them when it's time to do restores. Other possibilities here for hot add restores: the VM to restore and a VM that contains the hot add restore host are not in the same data center. So in this case here, I'm using a virtual media server. That virtual media server must be present in the same data center in order for the restore to work. If the restore host can't access the VMware data store over the selected transport mode, that'll be an issue. If I try to restore to a path with a path name longer than 1023 characters, that'll cause the restore to fail. It's an invalid path length. If the ESX server is configured with a short host name and cannot be found for the restore, that can cause the status code. Best practice is always to use fully qualified domain names for all ESX servers. And honestly, it's a good idea to use it everywhere in your net backup environment. And then lastly, if the VM hardware version is later than the hardware version that the target supports, VMware tools will attempt to convert the hardware version. If it is not able to do so, then you'll get the 2820. In this next topic, we'll talk about troubleshooting Hyper-V backups. Here's an example of the process flow that's used during a Hyper-V backup. In many ways, Hyper-V is similar to VMware, but one of the important differences is VMware, when we use VMware policies, we're always doing an off-host backup, where we have a backup host that's communicating with the ESX server. In Hyper-V, that's usually not the case. What we're doing instead is we're installing the NetBackup client directly on the Hyper-V host system. In fact, if you want to, you could install the NetBackup media server right on the Hyper-V system and make it a SAN media server. But that's not what we've done in this example. In this example, Hyper-V is a client, and I have a separate media server that's going to be backing it up. So the backup job is initiated by the scheduler as normal. BPBRM Backup and Restore Manager is started on the media server and reaches out to the Hyper-V host system. The NetBackup client software, in this case the BPFIS process, is going to communicate with VSS to initiate the snapshot. It's the responsibility of the VSS Hyper-V writer to quiesce the virtual machines and to create the snapshot, which by default will be created on the host volume. NetBackup client, BCAR, can then read the snapshot data and transfer it to the media server, which writes it to tape or to disk. When the backup is complete, then NetBackup sends a signal to VSS releasing this snapshot, and then Hyper-V can then return the virtual machine to its original state. This slide is an excellent reference for Hyper-V backup and restore log locations. Remember that certain logs are stored on certain hosts, so make sure you're looking at the appropriate server to get the information that you're looking for. Note that a lot of the same processes that were useful in troubleshooting VMware are also useful in troubleshooting Hyper-V. Also remember that, and this is unique to Hyper-V, that the Windows event logs can contain valuable data, and they should be collected from Hyper-V servers and from virtual machines. Here's some Hyper-V troubleshooting tips. During the policy creation, before we've even started to run the backup job, if we get errors when the policy is being validated, cannot connect on socket, or error validating the Hyper-V machine name, this might be an indication that the NetBackup client service is not running on the Hyper-V server. If I'm trying to back up a clustered instance of Hyper-V, it might be that the client service is not running on the current node of the cluster. Verify that the client service is running, and if it is running, try stopping and restarting it and attempting policy creation again. Now, if policy validation failed for other reasons, it might be that name resolution is the problem. Check and make sure that there's a hostname entry for this virtual machine in DNS or in the hostname, whichever one you're using. Also consider possible firewall issues. It may be that there's a firewall that's enabled and no port exists for the master server to be able to access the Hyper-V server, which is required for this process. This slide lists some of the more common Hyper-V backup status codes and some reasons why they might occur. There's a much more detailed explanation about these status codes in the article that's referenced on the slide, How to 70816, NetBackup status codes related to Hyper-V. The status code 156 we've mentioned before is a broad status code that indicates that the snapshot could not be created or that the snapshot failed during the backup process. A number of reasons why this might happen. Again, always consider resources first. Make sure that there is sufficient disk space for the snapshot to be created. Consider configuring VSS on the server to create the snapshot on a different volume than the volume that contains the VHD or VHDX files being snapped, if we suspect that space might be the issue, and also just because it makes the I/O more efficient. Also, be careful about overloading the server with too much simultaneous activity. Consider using resource limits to restrict how much activity there is on the Hyper-V server. Some other possible causes besides a lack of resources: maybe the VM name is incorrectly specified in the NetBackup policy. Maybe the Hyper-V integration component is absent. This is going to be required to be installed on the Hyper-V servers in the same way that we need VMware tools installed in VMware virtual machines. It might be a straight-up VSS error, where the VSS framework in a virtual machine is not working properly, and we can use the VSS admin command to help us troubleshoot that. This slide shows some common reasons for the status code 2817, which is a Hyper-V policy restore error. More details for most of these issues can be found in the article How to 70816, NetBackup status codes related to Hyper-V. This is the Troubleshooting Restores topic. This slide lists some common restore troubleshooting tips. First off, verify that the client's server list for server entries is correct. We need to make sure that the server that's tasked with performing the restore has the proper permission to be able to access this client. Particularly might be an issue with error if we're doing a cross-domain restore. I need to check the permissions where the files are restored in the case of a user restore. Users can get themselves jammed up if they try to restore data somewhere, and it would be an overwrite of an existing file, and the account that's running the bar console doesn't have permission to overwrite that file. That's not going to work. You wouldn't see that situation with an administrator restore, because administrators always restore as root in Unix or system in Windows. Also, make sure that you've got the right selections in the bar console to find the data that you're looking for. Make sure that the specify net backup machines and policy type information is correct, both the host name of the client, whose data you are searching for to restore, and be careful about short versus long names. Remember, for a net backup, the short name and long name are not the same. They're two different servers as far as net backup is concerned, no matter what kind of alias you might have in a host file. That's why it's very good to be consistent with client naming. Always stick with FQDN, and you can avoid that issue. Also be careful about the policy type. Make sure the policy type is set correctly for the type of data you're looking to restore. Here's some common restore status codes. The status code 5 is the restore failed to recover the requested files. So as we were discussing previously, permissions is oftentimes the case here. Verify the client's server list, and if you're doing a user-directed restore, make sure the user account has the proper permissions to restore the data. There are a lot of things in NetBackup that used to result in a status code 5 that now have distinct error codes associated with them, so this is a little less broad than it used to be. The status code 13 is a file read failure. In most cases, refreshing the bar console and trying again will usually help with that issue. The status 112 is no file specified in the file list. I need to make sure that I'm checking off at least one file for restore. Usually in the bar console, it won't even let you proceed to click the restore button unless you've done that, but that may happen if I'm trying to do a restore from the CLI. The 2800 is a standard policy restore error. There's a couple of different solutions here I should take a look at. I should take a look at the client's server list for server entries, make sure it's not a permissions issue. And the 2808, the file system policy restore error, this one is pretty broad. So I'm going to want to go through and take a look at the progress log within the bar console, and also some of the detailed debug logs to look for pointers as to what's causing this issue. Make sure that one thing is that the media server that is supposed to be doing the restore is available at the time the restore is being kicked off, and by default in NetBackup, the media server that did the backup is the media server that's going to do the restore. If you have an improperly decommissioned media server, this error can result, and the solution is to use the media host override option in the master server host properties. Also, make sure that the robot has been properly inventoried and that there's no active network issues. In this lesson, you learned how to troubleshoot common file system, snapshot, VMware, and Hyper-V backup and restore issues.